Okay, so now we're getting into LBJ's tenure as president and his Vietnam War. Now, LBJ inherited America's war in Vietnam, but whereas JFK's focus was on foreign policy and international affairs, LBJ's focus was on domestic policy. The real war he wanted to fight was the war on poverty. His program was called the Great Society, but the Vietnam War took most of his attention. LBJ did say later, that bitch of a war killed the woman I really loved, the Great Society. But LBJ was not about to be the president that lost Vietnam like Truman had lost China. He told Ambassador Lodge, I am not going to lose Vietnam. I am not going to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way China went. But LBJ felt he was stuck between a rock and a hard place. I knew from the start, he later said, that I was bound to be crucified either way I moved. If I left the woman I really loved, the Great Society, in order to get involved with that bitch of a war on the other side of the world, then I would lose everything at home. All my programs, all my hopes to feed the hungry and feed the homeless, all my dreams. But that's what he ended up doing. Now, after Ziem's death, things seemed to get more unstable. There were multiple coups by different generals. Things got so bad that one time LBJ said, I don't want to hear anything more about this coup shit, because he was just sick and tired of hearing about all the coups. Now, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara went to South Vietnam in the spring of 1964 to show America's support for the generals that had taken over. He said this, we are here to emphasize that the United States will maintain its interest and its presence in your country. We'll stay for as long as it takes. Now, LBJ faced two problems in Vietnam. The South had little stomach for the fight. Ziem's successors, it turned out, were even less successful than he was in curbing corruption and gaining popular support. Something like 1/3 of the South Vietnamese combat troops deserted every year. It's difficult for a superpower to win a war for a client state that doesn't really have the stomach to win the war for themselves. The other problem is that the North Vietnamese were willing to fight hard and for however long it took. The American people were willing to tolerate fewer casualties than the North Vietnamese. The longer the war drags on and the more costly it is, the less patience the American people would be with the war. But the Vietnam War is actually more about Cold War credibility than actually this little piece of land known as Vietnam. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, this is what he said. The integrity of the U.S. commitment is the principal pillar of peace throughout the world. If that commitment becomes unreliable, the communist world would certainly draw conclusions that would lead to our ruin and almost certainly to a catastrophic war. And one thing I want you to remember, most of these American officials that are guiding policy in Vietnam, they grew up during the appeasement of Hitler and then World War II. So the lessons that they took from history is if you let aggression succeed, that just gets more aggression and soon you have to fight a huge war. So why not stop aggression in its early stages? So that's what America's trying to do in Vietnam, stop communist aggression before it gets even bigger. Now there's an election coming up in the fall of 1964. Lyndon Johnson is going to run against Barry Goldwater, the Republican senator from Arizona. LBJ said that his biggest fear is that Barry Goldwater will make me look soft on communism and blame me for losing Vietnam to the communists, just like the Republicans did when China became communist. Now, in the fall before the election, something very important happened. This is called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The USS destroyer Maddox was sailing in the Gulf of Tonkin off of North Vietnam. It was gathering intelligence. On August 1st, the Maddox was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The Maddox fired back. There were no American casualties. The North Vietnamese boats were attacking because a few days earlier, South Vietnamese patrol boats in the area had attacked North Vietnamese islands. So they're kind of responding to this attack by South Vietnam. Later, Lyndon Johnson orders another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, to join the Maddox. And on August 4th, it's thought that the Maddox was again attacked, but this turned out not to be true. This attack never happened. It was mistaken. The people on the Maddox saw things on the radar. They thought they were getting attacked, but it was misunderstanding. But nevertheless, LBJ took it as an actual attack and retaliated by bombing North Vietnam for the first time. This was called Operation Pierce Arrow. It was 5 hours of sustained bombing. American aircraft attacked enemy torpedo bases and oil storage dumps. One American pilot was killed in the operations. LBJ also received congressional support when he passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This passed unanimously in the House, 416-0. It passed in the Senate, 88-2, so only 2 people dissented. So this Gulf of Tonkin resolution is a blank check for LBJ to do whatever he needs to do in South Vietnam, militarily speaking. It's a blank check to use the military in any way he sees fit. LBJ bragged of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. It's like grandma's nightshirt. It covers everything. Now, there was a twofold purpose of this Tonkin Gulf resolution. One, show the North Vietnamese that LBJ and America were not afraid of a fight. And 2, to show the American people that LBJ was a tough, cold warrior. He said this: "I knew that if we let communist aggression succeed in taking over South Vietnam, there would follow in this country an endless national debate, a mean and destructive debate that would shatter my presidency, kill my administration, and damage our democracy. I knew that Harry Truman and Dean Acheson had lost their effectiveness from the day that communists took over in China. I believe that the loss of China had played a large role in the rise of Joe McCarthy, and I knew that all these problems taken together were chicken shit compared with what might happen if we lost Vietnam." Now, with both parties supporting LBJ's policy in South Vietnam, the war wasn't really an issue in the election. LBJ painted himself as the peace candidate, and he painted Goldwater as the war candidate. Before the election, LBJ reassured the American people that we still seek no wider war. We are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. But that's what he ends up doing, is actually sending troops to Vietnam. Now, in October 1964, North Vietnam decided to start sending regular North Vietnamese army units south. The goal is to have troops in place by 1965 that can initiate a bold strike and perhaps win the war before America becomes too involved. So in 1964 and 1965, there are numerous Viet Cong attacks carried out in South Vietnam, and thousands of government officials are killed in assassinations. Americans are also targeted. You can kind of see a list here of all of the attacks that took place. There's lots of attacks. The Viet Cong attacking American air bases in the South, American hotels frequented by American soldiers and generals and officials. So there's a lot of attacks carried out by the Viet Cong against American and ARVN targets in the South. Well, what ends up happening is LBJ decides to retaliate because of all these attacks. He launches something called Operation Rolling Thunder. This begins in March 1965. It's basically an attempt by LBJ to bomb North Vietnam into submission. Hopefully that will force them to stop supporting the Viet Cong. It will also stop the flow of supplies going into South Vietnam. Lots of supplies that kind of kept the Viet Cong going came from the north. Now, Operation Rolling Thunder is only supposed to last 8 weeks. LBJ picks out the targets personally. He bragged, "They can't even bomb an outhouse without my approval." Like I said, the goal is to apply pressure on North Vietnam and to attack the supplies that come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, to protect the planes needed for Operation Rolling Thunder, General Westmoreland requests 2 battalions, that's 3,500 troops, to defend American airfields in South Vietnam, and he gets them. The 1st Battalion of Marines will land in South Vietnam on March 8, 1965, to go to Da Nang to protect the American aircraft there. In the spring of 1965, LBJ would send a total of 72,000 troops to Vietnam. But by the end of 1965, there would be over 200,000 American troops in Vietnam. The first of these go to Da Nang. Now, there's a lot of debate in the spring of 1965 about sending more troops to Vietnam. Robert McNamara writes a really famous memo in July of 1965 that basically outlines America's problem and their options. So in McNamara's memo, there's three options. The first option is America could just cut their losses and withdraw. The second option is America could continue at about the present level, so keep things the same. The third option is America could expand promptly and substantially the U.S. pressure and basically try to win the war in Vietnam. So LBJ decides to go with this third option. So on TV on July 28, 1965, LBJ says this: I have asked the commanding general, General Westmoreland, what more he needs to meet this mounting aggression. He has told me, and we will meet his needs. We cannot be defeated by force of arms. We will stand in Vietnam. So this is when he decides to send hundreds of thousands of soldiers to Vietnam. Now, he doesn't ask Congress for permission to do this. He does it because he has the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the blank check that allows him to do this. So this is the point where the war is Americanized. Now, despite Americanization and escalation, LBJ still hopes for a deal. A little bit before he announced all these troops going to Vietnam, he did talk at Johns Hopkins University on April 7th, 1965, and he promised Southeast Asia a $1 billion Marshall Plan, an Asian Marshall Plan. Basically, LBJ thought he could use America's money to kind of bribe or cajole Ho Chi Minh into ending the war, but that doesn't end up happening. Now, there's different opinions about how American troops should operate in South Vietnam. General Westmoreland wants American troops patrolling the countryside and looking for the Viet Cong going on the offensive. But Maxwell Taylor, the American ambassador to South Vietnam, he wants American troops to stay along the Vietnamese coast, defending American bases and cities. He doesn't want Americans to go out into the jungles and start doing all this fighting. Well, General Westmoreland's search and destroy strategy ends up winning out. That's what American soldiers end up doing. General Westmoreland said, the South Vietnamese armed forces cannot stand up to this pressure without substantial U.S. combat support on the ground. We are in for the long pull. I see no likelihood of achieving a quick, favorable end to the war. So in mid-1965, America's mission in South Vietnam changes. U.S. troops originally came to secure American air bases, but now U.S. troops are actively looking to engage the enemy in combat. So the war has been Americanized, and there's going to be a lot of search and destroy missions. So let's kind of look at that. One of the first missions, major missions, was called Operation Starlight. In the fall of 1965, the Americans launched the biggest battle since the Korean War. This was Operation Starlight. It was to be the first regimental-sized battle since the Korean War, and it was to be solely an American attack. Over 4,000 Americans would take part in an attack on a Viet Cong stronghold near Van Tuong. Operation Starlight was a success. The American forces had used intelligence to find the Viet Cong, surround them in a fixed position so they could not use ambushes or melt away into the jungle, and destroy them with superior firepower and numbers. So those tactics work. But in the fall of 1965, Ho Chi Minh changes tactics. Ho Chi Minh invades the South Vietnamese Central Highlands. 2 NVA regiments, and one more on its way, make their way down the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia. They plan to capture the provincial capital of Pleiku, continue along Route 19 to Quy Nhon, and cut South Vietnam in two. To prevent this, Americans placed the 1st Air Cavalry Division, its most mobile division, in the An Khe Valley. Now, the 1st Air Cavalry Division has about 15,000 men and 500 helicopters. And this is where the Battle of Ya Drang takes place. If you've ever seen the movie We Were Soldiers, that's what that movie is about, the Battle of Ya Drang. So this occurs in November of 1965. Now, at Ya Drang, the NVA is defeated and forced to pull back towards Cambodia. Casualties from the Play Coup operation and the Battle of Ya Drang results in 300 Americans from the air cavalry dead and 1,300 NVA dead. Both sides claimed victory, but American forces had inflicted more casualties and prevented South Vietnam from being cut in two. Ya Drang showed that if American forces could force the NVA into open fighting, they could inflict such heavy casualties that the NVA would be forced to give up. Now, Ya Drang convinces General Westmoreland that his search and destroy, his war of attrition, is the way to fight the war. After Ya Drang, Westmoreland, his strategy is to continue to use these search and destroy tactics to find, trap, and destroy the Viet Cong with overwhelming firepower and numbers. That is what the U.S. and the ARVN military spent 1966 and 1967 doing, searching for and destroying the Viet Cong. So basically, here's how the war of attrition, here's how that strategy works. In a war of attrition, you try to wear the enemy down so much that he cannot continue the fight. General Westmoreland would use 3 criteria to measure success in this war of attrition. 1, how many enemy supplies were captured or destroyed. 2, how many enemy bases were destroyed. And 3, the body count, how many enemy soldiers were killed. Westmoreland decides to conduct massive search and destroy missions to defeat the NVA and the Viet Cong. But by the end of 1965, North Vietnam changes their strategy. They don't want to fight any more pitched battles. They decide to use hit and run tactics, and they decide to send more troops from the north into the south. So let's kind of look at operations in 1966 and 1967. The biggest concentration of Viet Cong forces was between Saigon and the Cambodian border in areas known as the Iron Triangle, War Zone C, and War Zone D. These bases are supplied with men and weapons via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, the Ho Chi Minh Trail is this jungle trail that stretched from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam. That's how supplies get to the Viet Cong in the south. Now, the Americans bombed the Ho Chi Minh Trail to prevent supplies from reaching the Viet Cong, and they hopefully want to kill as many Viet Cong soldiers as they can so they can't be replaced, or North Vietnamese soldiers coming down so they can't replace the Viet Cong. But despite massive bombings of the Ho Chi Minh Trail throughout the war, the Americans were never able to shut off the supplies or the men that came from North Vietnam. Operation Crimp was launched in January 1966. It was a massive search and destroy operation around Saigon. Some 8,000 troops, including Australian and New Zealand troops, went out looking for Viet Cong in the Cu Chi district. In the Cu Chi district, the Viet Cong build these massive tunnel systems. They have trap doors, miles of tunnels, underground barracks and hospitals, factories, storerooms, kitchens, sleeping quarters. These tunnels lead to ambush points. American and ARVN soldiers often get sniped, but they don't even know where the sniping is coming from. In February and March, 4 major search and destroy missions are carried out just north of Saigon. In April and May 1966, Operation Birmingham is carried out. This is a large search and destroy mission in War Zone C. In September and November 1966, Operation Attleboro took place. This is a massive search and destroy mission that eventually involved 22,000 U.S. soldiers and 22,000 ARVN soldiers. By the end of 1966, numerous search and destroy missions had resulted in more than 6,000 American deaths and 30,000 wounded. During 1966, some 60,000 Viet Cong had been killed. However, Westmoreland's war of attrition wasn't working, as the Viet Cong were replacing their killed faster than Westmoreland could kill them. In January 1967, a massive search and destroy mission was undertaken in the Iron Triangle. The Iron Triangle was a 60 square mile Viet Cong stronghold near Saigon. This was called Operation Cedar Falls, and it opened with 4 days of B-52 bombings, followed by artillery and airstrikes. Then on January 8th, 16,000 U.S. troops and 14,000 ARVN troops moved in to attack the Iron Triangle. The Viet Cong had mostly evacuated the Iron Triangle before U.S. and ARVN troops moved in, but there was fierce fighting with the small Viet Cong forces that were left behind. 72 American soldiers were killed, while over 700 Viet Cong were killed. The Americans completely destroyed the Iron Triangle. They burned villages, removed the remaining inhabitants, and defoliated the forests. Defoliation was the purpose of something called Operation Ranch Hand. Aircraft would spray defoliants such as Agent Orange that would kill vegetation and trees and make it impossible to grow crops. The idea was that if there was no jungle, there would be no Viet Cong. However, as soon as U.S. forces left the Iron Triangle, the Viet Cong moved right back in and built their bases back up. From February to May of 1967, another large search and destroy mission is undertaken. This is called Operation Junction City. Over 30,000 U.S. and 5,000 ARVN soldiers take place in this. This is an attack on the Viet Cong stronghold in War Zone C. If you add Operation Cedar Falls and Operation Junction City together, 282 American lives are lost with over 1,500 wounded, but almost 3,000 Viet Cong are killed. U.S. and ARVN forces also capture or destroy many Viet Cong supplies and destroy many Viet Cong bases. But there had been no great battles of annihilation. General Giap had changed his tactics in late 1965 and they paid off for the North. General Giap had 4 principles of guerrilla warfare, and he uses this to fight the war. If the enemy advances, we retreat. If the enemy halts, we harass. If the enemy avoids battle, we attack. And if the enemy retreats, we follow. So it's kind of hard to fight an enemy that's fighting this way. Now, search and destroy operations are met with ambushes for helicopters. Snipers were everywhere. There's also a lot of booby traps throughout the Vietnam War. Some of the most terrifying booby traps were deadly snakes called two-step Charlies, because after you were bitten, you took 2 steps and you were dead. Poisonous snakes would be left in pits that soldiers would fall into, or they would be nailed to trees in the jungle and would bite soldiers as they walked by. Keepsakes were booby traps left in souvenirs that were left behind by retreating Viet Cong. They would have explosives inside that would blow off your hand when you picked them up. Some of these keepsakes were lighters, fountain pens, or cans of food. They even had flag poles with enemy flags, and when you would take down the enemy flag, a bomb would go off. Punji sticks were sharpened sticks that were placed in hidden pits. When a soldier fell in, they would be stabbed by these sticks. These sticks were often covered in poison or human feces to kind of create infection. There were also tripwire arrows that would impale a soldier when a wire was tripped. There was also something called a tiger trap, which was a suspended block of spikes that would fall directly on top of a soldier when it was tripped. There were also spiked logs that were 8 to 10 feet long that would swing into the path of a soldier and impale him. Now, U.S. forces do adjust to these kind of booby trap tactics and other Viet Cong tactics. Helicopter landings become much faster. Soldiers spread out so as not to be clustered together as a prime target for a machine gun attack. Soldiers also learn to be careful while walking through the jungles and look out for these booby traps. So kind of let's assess the 1966 and 1967 search and destroy missions. In many ways, they're considered failures. There was no big battle of annihilation. Instead, the Viet Cong often melted away into the jungle or across the border into Cambodia, where American and ARVN soldiers could not chase them. American and ARVN forces suffered thousands of deaths and tens of thousands of casualties because of Viet Cong ambushes, snipers, and booby traps. The Viet Cong were not being killed faster than they could be replaced. So those are ways search and destroy missions are failures. In other ways, you could call them a success. Viet Cong installations throughout South Vietnam were damaged. Lots of supplies and weapons were captured or destroyed. Tens of thousands of Viet Cong were killed. Now, in July 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara traveled to South Vietnam. He had begun to have doubts about the American strategy. He suggested to Johnson that America prepare for a long war. Also, in the spring and summer of 1967, North Vietnam changed strategy. They decided that they were going to come out and in the open and fight the U.S. and the ARVN forces in what would hopefully be a decisive battle. This is going to be called the TET Offensive. So in April 1967, the NVA began attacking American and ARVN bases in such locations that they could draw the American forces out of the cities, especially in southern Vietnam and Saigon. That way, when they launched their main attack in January 1968, which was supposed to take place in the cities of South Vietnam, the less well-trained ARVN forces would be the only forces in the cities standing in their way. But American and ARVN forces were pulled out of the cities in 1967 to meet these attacks. But American leadership suspected an attack was coming in the cities, so they redeployed their men into the cities. Now, in late 1967, LBJ summoned General William Westmoreland home. In something referred to as a campaign of optimism, Westmoreland reassured the public that the war was almost won. He told the public that, quote, "There is light at the end of the tunnel." He added, "I am absolutely certain that whereas in 1965 the enemy was winning, today he is certainly losing. There are indications that the Viet Cong and even Hanoi know this. It is significant that the enemy has not won a battle in more than a year." Towards the end of 1967, Lyndon Johnson said similar things. He said, "All the challenges have been met. The enemy is not beaten, but he knows that he has met his master in the field." Well, that's what happens in 1967 towards the end. And then starting in January 1968, you have the TET Offensive. The TET Offensive is the major North Vietnamese offensive against the South, launched on January 30th, 1968 during the Tet Lunar New Year. Now, every year there was a Tet truce between the North and the South, but because General Giap believes surprise is the key to victory, he decides to attack during the New Year. More than 80,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army troops took part in this offensive. Now, because of the Tet New Year, it's easy for the Viet Cong to infiltrate South Vietnamese cities. There's a lot of people going in and out of the cities. Also during Tet, lots of ARVN soldiers are on leave away from their units because they want to celebrate the new year. Now, the Tet Offensive targets 5 major cities, 64 district capitals, 36 provincial capitals, 50 hamlets, and important targets in Saigon, such as the American Embassy, the government radio station, the Tan Son Nhut Airport, the Independence Palace, and various military headquarters. American and ARVN forces are scattered and confused, and military units are shorthanded. Now, the goal of the Tet Offensive is to break the deadlock in the war and produce a popular uprising in the South that would see the people overthrow the anti-communist government there. Ho Chi Minh and General Giap had been laying the groundwork for the Tet Offensive since late 1967. Hanoi intensifies pressure on the central highlands of South Vietnam, the demilitarized zone, and the garrison at Khe Son. Viet Cong units also begin infiltrating the major cities of the South. Now, the reason Hanoi took these steps in the Central Highlands, the DMZ, and the garrison at Khe Son is to draw American and ARVN troops away from Saigon in the South. This would then help the Viet Cong units infiltrate the cities in the South and win battles there.